Anybody remember the old Atari systems? I love the old Atari games. It's like the graphics are absolutely horrendous compared to today, but I'm telling you, some of those games were the best games ever. You know, the Nintendo came out in the mid '80s, and before that, we had an Atari, and we had the Atari. Oh, clear up until the time I was 10 or 12 years old. It finally just gave out. But games like Frogger was one of my favorites. I love that game. You know, Asteroids was another one of my favorites. You know, pew 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 pew, you just blow up the asteroids there. Another one of my favorites was Pitfall. And oh, that game was so frustrating. You know, you'd go swinging on the ropes, and you know, you'd try to jump off at the right point, but you know, you'd mess up and end up falling in that pit. You know, it's always kind of a bummer to end up falling in the pit because it just, you know, it's enormously difficult to get back out of them again. Today we're going to talk a lot about the unfaithful Jews. We're going to continue on in our sermon series through Romans, revolutionary righteousness. And this week we're going to focus on the Jews. But more than anything, I brought up the whole Atari thing in the game of Pitfall for a reason. Because there are some pitfalls that the Jews fell into that we need to be very, very, very careful of. Okay? This week we're going to continue on. Read with me. It's going to be Romans 2:17 to 29. We're going to finish up chapter 2 here. It'll be on the board, or you can flip to your Bible and read along with me. Now, if you call yourself a Jew and rest in the law, and boast in God, and know his will, and approve the things that are superior, being instructed from the law, and are convinced that you are a guide for the blind, a light to those in darkness, an instructor of the ignorant, a teacher of the immature, having in the law the full expression of knowledge and truth. You then, who teach another, do you not teach yourself? You who preach, you must not steal. Do you steal? You who say you must not commit adultery, do you commit adultery? You who detest idols, do you rob their temples? You who boast in the law, do you dishonor God by breaking the law? For, as it is written, the name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you. For circumcision benefits you if you observe the law. But if you are a lawbreaker, your circumcision has become uncircumcision. Therefore, if an uncircumcised man keeps the law's requirements, will his uncircumcision not be counted as circumcision? A man who is physically uncircumcised but who fulfills the law will judge you who are a lawbreaker in spite of having the letter of the law and circumcision. For a person is not a Jew who is one outwardly, and true circumcision is not something visible in the flesh. On the contrary, a person is a Jew who is one inwardly, and circumcision is of the heart, by the Spirit, not the letter. His praise is not from men, but from God. We start off in verse 17 here, and Paul kind of goes, it's a list. He's continuing on through this, and a couple of weeks ago we talked about the slippery slope of sin, and we moved on through last week, and we talked about judgment and how the entire world is going to fall under God's judgment, and how we all are guilty in the eyes of God. We are all guilty in the eyes of God, okay? We are when we fall under God's judgment, it is righteous and it is deserved, that judgment that he gives. Okay? This week, he's continuing on. He says, And now if you call yourself a Jew and rest in the law and boast in God. Now that's verse 17, and he goes on and there's a list of things that he names here. And this list are things the Jews thought about themselves in relation to others, meaning the Gentiles. Okay? These are the things that the Jews thought about themselves in relation to others. Number one, they trust in the law. The law was given to them, not to anybody else. Okay? The law came through Moses. Moses dictated, God dictated to Moses, and it was given on the Ten Commandments, and Moses even wrote it down and passed on what was taught, all these rules and regulations. They trusted in the law, and because they trusted in the law, they also, number two, they boasted about God. Because they were God's people. Okay? They boasted about God because God was theirs. Okay? It was he was their God. So they trusted in the law and they boasted about God. But not only that, they also know his desires and his purposes. Having had the law, and because God was their God, I will be their God and they will be my people, is what he says over and over again and throughout the Old Testament there in the first 5 books. I will be their God and they will be my people. But because of this, they also know his desires and his purposes. They know God's will. So they rest in the law, they boast in God, they know his will. Okay? And number 4, they says that they have tested and approved that God's ways are superior. They know that God's ways, that's the whole purpose of the law, is to set us apart, or to set them apart as his own people. God's ways of conducting themselves in life, and we look at the spirit of the law, God's ways are a better way to live. It is a better way to live. They have tested and approved that God's ways are superior. Why? Because they are instructed from the law. The law instructs them on how to live a life that is a godly and upright life. Reason number 6, he goes on. He says that they're convinced that they are a guide for the blind, that they are a light for those in darkness, they are instructors of the ignorant, and they are teachers of the immature. They believe all these things. They are a guide for the blind. They're a light to those in darkness. They are instructors of the ignorant, teacher of the immature. They've been set apart for these reasons. And number 7, they have the embodiment of knowledge and truth in the law. They have that embodiment of knowledge and truth. That's what the law is about. The law is about wisdom, knowledge, and truth. And that is the embodiment of that in the law. Is it any wonder that when Christ came, he didn't say that he was going to get rid of the law? No. He fulfills the law. Christ is the embodiment in human form of the law. That's what he is. He embodies that law through and through. He didn't come to get rid of the law. That's just not true. He came to fulfill it. He is the law. He is the embodiment of that. And this is where Paul's going with all this. I'm kind of getting ahead of myself here, but this is where Paul's going with all of this. Okay? He's continuing to build this case, and he's building one heck of a case. You know, I mean, it is one of the strongest arguments, and that's why Romans is so difficult, because most people can't get past the first 3 chapters. It's so difficult to hear. It's just not easy. I mean, it has tendency to kind of beat you up. But there's a reason why these letters were intended to be read as letters instead of taken, like we're going through here. It's going to be 34, 35, 36 weeks worth of preaching. These letters were read all at once, so we got the entire message within 45 minutes of reading the letter. We knew. But that's where he's going with all this. He's building this case. Paul asks, after he goes through and he's saying all these things and he's listing all these things because he knows that they're going to agree with him. Okay? He knows that any Jewish person who reads that section, well, yeah, we rest in the law, we boast in God, and we know God's will, and we approve the things that are superior. We're instructed from the law, and we're convinced that we're a guide for the blind, a light for those in darkness. We instruct the ignorant, and we're a teacher of the immature, and we have in the law the full expression of the knowledge and truth. So Paul, knowing that they're going to agree with everything that he's saying here, asks a series of questions. I love it. You talk about putting a nail in a coffin. I mean, it just, he's hammering it home. He goes, you then who teach another, do you not teach yourself? You who preach, you must not steal, do you steal? You who say you must not commit adultery, do you commit adultery? You who detest idols, do you rob their temples? You who boast in the law, do you dishonor God by breaking the law? It is an obvious answer. Yeah, you better darn well tootin' they do. Every single one of them. They broke every single one of them. They lost it. He says, and he quotes here, he says, for it is written, the name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you. You think you're better than everybody else, but yet you're not. You're nowhere close to being better than everybody else because my name is blasphemed among the Gentiles because your inability to keep my ways and my laws. You failed miserably, Jewish nation. And that's pretty much what he's saying. Paul goes on. He continues, he says, for circumcision benefits you if you observe the law. But if you're a lawbreaker, your circumcision has become uncircumcision. Paul is explaining here, and he goes into this next section here. And he's explaining that the rite of circumcision is not what defines a Jew. It's a physical trait, okay? For the males, I believe the circumcision was done on the 8th day, I think it was, prescribed in the law, on the males. And it was an outward sign of a covenant that God had made with Abraham. But they rested in this ritual and rite that was of the physical nature and completely missed the spiritual side of it. If you remember back, one of the very first few weeks that I was here, I preached through Exodus 3. And you remember that God was about that close from striking Moses down because he failed to keep the covenant of circumcision. It's not the outward sign of circumcision that defines a Jew. It is that inward change in a man or woman that defines it. It's somebody who obeys the law. Verse 26, he says, therefore, if an uncircumcised man keeps the law's requirements, will his uncircumcision not be counted as circumcision? A man who is physically uncircumcised, but who fulfills the law, will judge you who are a lawbreaker in spite of having the letter of the law in the circumcision. The rite of circumcision is not what defines a Jew, but it's somebody who obeys the law and obeys God. Remember, keep this in the back of your mind, remember that righteousness is our standing before God. Obedience is our attitude, and faith is how we live. And notice, because we've been talking for about 2 or 3 weeks now, the word obedience has come up every week. Have you noticed that? Paul is hammering hammering home a point here. And that's the fact that obedience is vital. But it is vital in regards to where we put it in our lives. Okay? Obedience is a recurring theme here in this opening part of the book. And the fact that he's talking about it's those who obey God who are counted as righteous. It is, circumcision isn't somebody who is physically circumcised. It is somebody who has the circumcision of the heart, not the physical. Okay, and that's what he says in verses 28 and 29. He says, "For a person is not a Jew who is one outwardly, and true circumcision is not something visible in the flesh. On the contrary, a person is a Jew who is one inwardly, and circumcision is of the heart by the Spirit, not the letter. His praise is not from men, but from God." It isn't about rites and rituals. It's not about a rite and ritual. Now, don't get me wrong. Sometimes the rites and rituals are there for good and great purposes. The physical sign of circumcision was intended to be a reminder to them, to be in the forefront of their mind, that they were set apart, that they were to obey God. Don't look for approval in men, rites, or rituals, but instead seek approval from God. It is not, don't find your approval in a rite or a ritual or in the approval of man. Man in the general sense of the term, a human. Okay? Don't look for approval there, because we as humans have a tendency to kind of look for approval in these things. We have a tendency, and I've got a friend who just, he loves high church, just the Catholic form of worship is just all up his alley, and he's a Protestant minister in an independent Christian church. But he loves the ritualistic nature of the Catholics. It's just, he appreciates that high church kind of thing. That's not a bad thing. As a matter of fact, it can be a good thing if we put it into perspective and we put it in its proper place. Rites and rituals can be there. They can be good things, but they can also be idols too. And they can be very, very damaging idols, might I add. Okay? When we seek approval from mankind, we're looking for that outward approval and that we kind of need to survive. But instead, we need to seek approval from God. We need to seek approval inwardly. We need to seek approval on the inside of our heart that only God can see. It's one of the reasons why when we give, we're told to give in secret, to not let your right hand or the left hand know what the right hand is doing. There's a reason for that. It's this outward, inward kind of look. We don't do it for the approval of man, which is what the Pharisees were doing. They're like, oh yeah, look at me. I'm giving all this money. And they paraded around in the streets, and if they had newspapers back then, it'd have been all over the newspapers and in the news, and probably they'd have announced it on Facebook and all over the place. But they didn't have that stuff back then. But that's what they essentially in our culture and day and time, that's what they were doing. They were announcing it all right there. Instead, no, we need to inwardly seek approval from God. And it's a wonderful thing to see people take that to heart. It's awesome. And usually, when you find out about it, it's by an accident usually, because it usually doesn't come to light ever. You see, the Jews were at the point The Jews were at the point that they were of meticulously keeping the law. You see, brief history of the Jews in 2-3 minutes. We have Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, full covenant relationship with God, a great relationship. And each one of those 3 men developed a relationship with God. Were they flawed? Yeah, you better believe it. Abraham lied. Jacob stole his birthright. He was not exactly truth tellers there. But they were imperfect, but they had a covenant relationship with God. Moses, you fast forward 430 years from the time Jacob and Joseph and all them went to Egypt, and you come to the point where Moses, and they've got the law, and they followed the law to the T for a while, but they started to stray in the grand scheme of time pretty quickly afterwards. And they got to the point that they were so filled with idols and all of this other stuff that God had no other choice but to send them into exile to get them to come back to him. And when they did, they went the complete opposite direction, and they were so legalistic that they made laws upon God's law, so they didn't even come close to breaking the law of God. Folks, you missed the whole cart. You missed the whole point. The point is not keeping the law to the T. It is, but it isn't. They missed the point that it's only by faith. They missed it because the law is not enough. The law is the embodiment of God, and we are nowhere even close to being perfect. Christ fulfills that law. Christ fulfills that perfectly. And that's the point that Paul's getting to. You see, faith, righteousness, and obedience. And we come back to our circle again. And last week I introduced the thought that in order to come to faith, which is where we start, we kind of have to have a little bit of obedience about us in order to come to faith. Because in order to come to faith, we have to obey. We have to confess, repent, and be baptized. And that is an era of submission, which is what obedience is all about. So, we start off with faith, but a little bit of obedience in there. And last week I kind of proposed that a lot of people try to get obedience again on the other side of faith in 2 different places, and they completely miss the righteousness boat. You see, when we obey in faith and come to faith, it's not about doing works. We've already been imparted with Christ's perfect righteousness. Nothing we're going to do on our own. Obedience is the natural fruit of being clothed in Christ's righteousness. It's a natural byproduct. Obedience keeps coming up here in the first part of Romans to stress the point that God requires strict obedience in order to be righteous before him. And that is simply pointing to the fact that we are never going to accomplish that on our own. He is hammering a point home that by obedience on our own alone, it will not work. We can't do it. We need Jesus. We need Jesus. And as we get to, it'll be the latter part, second half of chapter 3, where Paul finally starts getting to the idea of righteousness through faith. And we're going to start applying the point as to why righteousness comes before obedience. Okay? The law simply points to our inability. to keep it meticulously. It's impossible. The law simply points to our inability to keep it meticulously. Therefore, we need to be careful not to fall into the pitfall of superiority like the Jews did. You see, the Jews, because they were God's people, because they had gotten the law, because they had had the physical rite of circumcision, thought that they were better than everybody else. We're set apart. We're God's people, and we are better than everybody else. No. Wrong. That's not it. You are not better than anybody else. You are superior to no one. And that's exactly what Paul has been lining out thus far, is the fact that not only are the Gentiles guilty, but you are too, and more so you, because my name has been blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you. Your responsibility was to me, and you failed. My friends, that pitfall lies before the church today. If there was ever a conviction when I was reading this week, that was it. It's like, oh my, I see this before the American church horribly. We are literally at the precipice of this pitfall, getting ready to just step right into it, if we haven't already. My friends, a church is not a club or a society of perfect people. That is not what a church is. A church is a hospital for sinners. It is a place where broken, hurting, addicted, and the people we call morally degenerate, it's where they come to be healed by the ultimate healer. That is the whole point of why we gather here. It is to be a hospital for sinners. If I'm not mistaken, the hospital for sinners idea comes from Mark 2:15, if I'm not mistaken. If it's going to be somewhere right around in there. Got a sermon on that somewhere on YouTube. I preached about that. But that covers this idea. We kind of, unfortunately, we kind of get this idea that we're kind of an elitist kind of club or society. It's almost like it's, in some places, it's almost like it's a country club, and you got to have a certain membership in order to belong there. And that's not what Christ came for. He came for the broken and the hurting, the addicted. He came for the morally degenerate people. We see over and over in the Gospels where Christ is dining with sinners and tax collectors. Today, we see sinners and tax collectors. Well, we kind of don't like the tax man these days, but in that day and age, he was a big no-no guy to hang out with. You did not go with the tax collectors. You didn't associate with the sinners, as we saw this morning in our Sunday school. These kind of people, these people who were unclean, these were people you did not hang around. You were not part of that group. You didn't go anywhere near them because of the fact that we are set apart and we can't be associated with that. And that is not the point of the law. The law is to set us apart, to show them that there is a better way to live. That you don't have to be broken. You don't have to be hurting. You don't have to be addicted to whatever it is that you're addicted to. You don't have to be morally degenerate anymore. You can be set free. There is a better way to live. That's what the law is about. The law is to set us apart, to show them that there is a better way. And it's the point that we think we're superior to others that we are on the precipice of falling into that pit. The big idea this morning it's just that. It's the pitfall. As Christians, we must be cautious not to fall into the pitfall of superiority like the Jews did. My friends, true circumcision is not of the flesh, but it is of the Spirit. So, man, woman, child, senior saint, let me ask you, are you spiritually circumcised? Are you marked for God? If you are, you know full well that you are not better than anybody else. That it doesn't matter what other people's pitfalls are, that you've been there. Maybe not the same type of deal that they're battling with, because each person has their own battle. But you've been there. You've been in need of saving. I did an interview with somebody one time. And I was asking him questions for a class of mine. And I said, when were you baptized? He said, I was baptized at the age, I think he said 5 or something like that. And I said, okay, wow, you started off young. Has there ever been any kind of a point where you struggled with anything, where you felt like you walked away from God? You know what his answer was? No. Really? You don't feel like you've ever, been to the point of walking away from God or anything? No. Oh my. I'm not going to presume to judge, but that's not a very good place to be. If I sat here and asked you the same question, will you have the same response? Or are you going to be able to go through your past and realize that you are just as bad off as the next person? We're really not superior to anybody. This is a hospital. I'm the spiritual doctor. We have spiritual nurses in the congregation who are doctors and nurses and people who are here to be encouragers and healers. And I'm not the only doctor in the group, folks. There are doctors and nurses, but there's always something greater than that doctor or nurse in the hospital. God's always present there. And even the doctors and nurses submit to the one authority. And that's what it's about. So stand with me and sing Hymn of Invitation. Come to the greatest physician there ever was, Jesus Christ. Sing with me, The Savior is Waiting, number 326.